Hello and welcome to Captains of Industry. I'm Chris Bishop. I'm in Dubai and I'm about to interview CEO of APO Group, Lionel Reina. We're going to talk about the economic landscape of Africa. We're going to talk about entrepreneurs, and hopefully a bit later in the program we're going to talk about rugby in Africa. So just tell me, Lionel, to start off with just a little about who you are. You know, what makes you, what's your background?
I was born in Lyon, in France. I'm 51 years old. I'm a French citizen originally. And I've been privileged enough to travel the world the last 26 years. My career brought me to almost every corner of the world. I lived and worked in Europe, in the US, in Latin America, Middle East and Africa. I had a career so far in technology and media. I worked more than 25 years in technology, and 10 years of which as a CEO of Middle East and Africa for the B2B division of Orange. I was based in Dubai, so it's a little bit of a homecoming for me, and I'm very glad to be back. So technology has been my world for a long time. I provided all my career services for enterprise. And recently I decided to move to media, and I'm currently the CEO of APO Group. We are the leading media relation company across Africa and the Middle East. We are serving 300 multinational companies. So again, I continue my work working with companies. And for those companies, we provide communication services across the African continent and the Middle East.
Tell me just a little bit more about the influences that shaped you. I mean, you're born in Lyon. Your family, what sort of a family did you come from?
Well, I come from a father that was an engineer in the electrical company in France, and my mother was a nurse. They're still alive, they live in France. Wonderful childhood, and the capacity to be educated. And this is always what I cannot thank my parents enough to have given me the education I had that allowed me to continue my world and my career internationally. I was educated in France and Germany. Perhaps one particularity in our family, I'm the only one that has been living and working abroad. My entire family is still in France and enjoying France life, but I decided to go another path. And one of the reasons why I was able to go the other path is most probably with the care and the love and the education I get from my parents. Yeah.
And what inspired you at an early age, you think, to go out and travel the world?
It's a very interesting question, Chris. And I think when I was 13 years old, a lot of problem with young people, they don't know what they want to do when they grow up. When I was 13 years old, I decided that I wanted to discover the world. And I think that, define who I am now and who I've been for the last 20 years. It was just a dream I had, to see what's out there and how I can contribute. And a little bit incidentally, I joined France Telecom at that time, and I made all my career a big part of my career in the telecom industry, bringing me everywhere. So the discovery of the world was my drive.
And now you're concentrating. Your company's present in all 54 countries.
Yes.
On the continent. How are you seeing, firstly, the media landscape on the continent? How are you seeing it evolving with the digital revolution that's going?
Well, I think you said it yourself. Digital revolution and technology changed completely the landscape of the media. What used to be traditional broadcast print work has completely evolved the last 5 to 10 years. And every actor in the media landscape in the world, but also in Africa, has to follow the flow and has to adapt, and which create opportunity and challenges. So the challenges are obviously, the capital to digitalize. The opportunities is really to reach audiences that you didn't have the capability to reach before. The digital world is a reality for every industry, and like I told you before, I work with companies all my career. every company has to digitalize, every company has to follow the trend, but more in the media is becoming fundamental to be geared in order to reach all the audiences. If we speak more specifically about the African landscape, capital is surely still an issue, access to funds in order to modernize. But I think with the continuous drive and evolution of the countries, and FDI will help, foreign investment will really help not only the agriculture segment or the industrial sector, but also the media. I personally believe that technology has already changed the way we communicate everywhere, but more specifically also in Africa.
It's a two-edged sword, isn't it, this digital? Because on the one hand, the one thing, when I first started reporting from this continent 25 years ago, when we do stories, people would say, oh, we never realized that was what was going on in Africa. No one knew. It was very much a quiet story, shall we say. But the other side of this is young people can see what the rest of the world is doing, and they can see what other rights and privileges other people are enjoying elsewhere. I mean, you lived during the Arab Spring here in this particular time. What do you think about this double-edged sword?
I think the narrative, particularly in the past across Africa, was either inexistent because of technology didn't exist, or negative. And I think what's happening with the development of new technology is, like I said before, larger audiences, but also the capabilities to give good news. That's something that also we strive to do with APO Group. We have a platform. When we send a press release through our platform across Africa, it reaches more than 400,000 journalists and 250 websites. Therefore, if we have a voice, we have a strong voice across the continent. Now, what we have been trying to do since the company exists is really to bring positive narrative about the continent, to bring positive news as opposed to, crime, as opposed to poverty, as opposed to all the problems. Now, if you combine that with the fact that indeed the young generation has access to information, you mentioned my experience in the Arab Spring. I was indeed in Dubai when the Arab Spring happened. And I saw the young generation using technology, and not to name it Facebook, in order to speak to each other and to organize really what would become the Arab Spring. So I always say when I'm asked, the Arab Spring is a Facebook revolution, and I believe this is what it was. And this is what technology opens, I believe, for young generation. They can have a voice, they can communicate, and because they see, what's out there through internet and other means, they can have the drive to be willing to get to that level.
And also, as talking about the double-edged sword, a lot of governments, particularly during election time in Africa, are catching on to this, and there have been instances that we've reported that where the internet's been suppressed or even cut off in some cases to stop people from communicating in the very way. I mean, does that concern you as a communicator?
I believe, technology is and will supersede, what's happening also domestically. Look what's happening with a large company like Facebook and Google. They just communicate. People communicate. So, whatever is happening on the domestic side from a political side, technology will drive communication among people. Technology will drive innovation. Technology will allow people to progress, really.
And aside from the media landscape, what about the economic hopes of the continent? From your communications with 400,000 journalists across the continent, well, what's the feeling you're getting back about the prospects for the future?
Well, I try to stay educated in the African economics. What I know is that, out of the last 5 years, there is a tremendous growth from some countries across the continent. Today, 6 out of the top 10 growing countries in the world are in Africa. I was in Ethiopia last week attending a large hospitality conference. The country is growing 8.5% a year. And yes, there are gaps in infrastructure, and yes, there are tremendous challenges to overcome, but the country is growing. If you have growth, and if you have foreign investment, and if you have a drive to make it happen, one can be only optimistic about the continent. One other reason why I personally am very optimistic is because the population is very young. It's very young, it has access to information, it has access more and more to technology, and therefore, with appropriate education, they will do the necessary step to build infrastructure, to develop startups, to bring the ideas to fruit. So personally, I'm very optimistic about the future of the continent. If you combine that with the fact that there is now a big effort across the continent to open the economic area, interior economic area. The free trade agreement was ratified by a large majority of countries. And if the African continent can continue to trade internally, the ratio of the percentage today of inter-trade in Africa is 17%, as opposed to 65% in the European Union. So if countries across Africa can communicate, can trade more amongst each other, overcoming custom barriers, overcoming financial barriers, overcoming currency barriers, then the future is very bright. The continent will double its population over the next 30 years, making emerging a very, very young and hopefully more and more qualified population.
And the stakes are very high. I mean, this young population you're talking about, it's the continent's biggest economic asset. But on the other hand, if that population is not given its head and put to work, then also there could be unrest happening, as we saw in the Arab Spring.
Well, this is where I think the combination of government and the private sector, trying to work together and overcome the different challenges, whether it's education, whether it's healthcare, whether it's infrastructure, comes to fruit. One without the other will not work. Once liked to say in the past that government is like in France. The government needs to do everything. No. I think there must be a common effort between governments contributing and also the private sector contributing. But in order to contribute, you need to have positive narrative. You need to have investor coming in. You need to have to facilitate the way investors can operate in one given country. But if that is happening more and more, in whatever form it is, private, public agreements, then the continent will continue to progress and infrastructure will continue to develop. It is estimated that currently there is a need of approximately $90 billion every year in order to close the infrastructure gap in Africa. The amount might be big, but at the bigger scale of things, it's not very large. So, if common effort can be done and can be continued to be pushed through, well, we can be very optimistic for the continent.
Hello, I'm Chris Bishop and you're with Captains of Industry. I've been speaking to Lionel Reina, the CEO of the APO Group here in Dubai. We've been talking about the economic landscape, the media landscape in Africa, and hopefully we're going to take it in a slightly different direction in this half. We talked a lot in the first half about the economic landscape, and yourself, like a lot of people involved in business on this continent, you believe entrepreneurs is where the future lies. What gives you hope in that direction? As a lot of entrepreneurs in this continent, a lot of struggling entrepreneurs in this continent, what gives you particular hope that this is the way forward?
As I mentioned to you before, I walked around the world, and I saw that different regions of the world at their time of development. If you look at Asia, the last 20 years, that was where the magic growth happened there, particularly in Singapore. If you look what happened in the Middle East the last 15 years, the oil price being at $80 or above, the Gulf countries could invest massively, and they did. And what's happening now is, well, Asia is down, Middle East is down, this is a tour of Africa. So we are, as I explained to you, serving 300 multinational companies, 50% of them being American headquartered one, 25% of them being from Europe investing in Africa, and the rest being 30% African headquartered and Middle Eastern headquartered company. Everyone are telling them we have a development plan for Africa. So I know for a fact that those companies are investing heavily. And because they have an investment plan, then they communicate more, and this is where we come to play. We help them to communicate and develop. There was recent announcement from an American company like Pepsi announced that they will invest $1.2 billion on the continent over acquiring a company and developing the business over the next 5 years. There is a drive from international corporations to invest in Africa. But that's not enough. You know, the investment of corporation is great. I'm not an economist, but I believe that it will help, but it's not enough. What also needs to happen is that the small and medium sector and startups have also to play their role in job creation. And you probably hear it all the time that the small and medium sector and the startups need to play a major role. But it is statistically proven, for example, in France and in continental Europe, that the segments that are creating jobs are small and medium and startup. Therefore, the French government created French Tech, which is a real success now. Now, if you can take those ideas and bring them to Africa, one can really be optimistic because job creation will come. I would mention one initiative which I followed seriously is what Tony Elumelu is doing in Nigeria. He is funding a certain number of startups every single year, 1,000 startups, but not only funding them, he's training the management and he's coaching the management, which I believe is fundamental because this is what a lot of startup investors forget. It's not only about get your first round of money. It's about following what's happening. It's about training the management. And if you can coach, mentor also to startups, then you're going to be successful. In the world, 80% of the startups are not making it the second year. This is the world statistic. In Africa, 50% of the startups are making it the second year. So we can be optimistic. That means that the program have been put in place are working. Now, is there a lot more to do on the large scales of the African continent? Of course. But I think this is a fantastic start. And this is something that we as a APO Group also supporting. We have launched recently a particular program to promote startups across the continent, and we're working with some of them already very successfully.
I've interviewed hundreds of entrepreneurs, the length and breadth of this continent. And to be fair, I mean, a lot of them see themselves as like the forgotten soldiers of the economy. They feel that no one takes any notice of them or cares about them, not even the banks, until they become successful. And the rest of the time, they feel they're just being left to sink or swim. How do you view that?
Like I said, you need to bring the narrative abroad. You need to portray a positive dynamic. You need to take out the issues from a purely domestic issues, which is probably one of the issues they have. If you stay on the purely domestic agenda, perhaps you will face difficulties, as opposed to if you are supported by an investor that has a bigger picture, it could work. For me, it's all about the narrative. It's all about giving the confidence to investor to invest, but not only to invest, to follow also the development. And you have very, very good example. I could mention an investment fund that we are working with out of Germany that have invested in the last 2 years in 50 or 60 startups across Africa. But like I said, they don't leave them alone. They don't just put the money and then go away. They follow the growth. And this is for me what will make the difference moving forward.
Well, what about the political will? I mean, I've heard politicians up and down the continent as well make speeches saying entrepreneurs are the future, the youth is the future, that's the job creators for us. But sometimes when it comes down to it, a lot of governments across Africa, they tie people up in red tape. They're not very cooperative sometimes when it comes to visas and when it comes to easing capital into the country. What do you think could be changed there?
Like I said, it needs to be both ways. You know, the governments needs to continue to progress, like every government in the world. They need to continue to invest in the digitalization of their economy. They need to be able to, have digital ideas as opposed to paper one. They need to perhaps also invest in universal health care. There are 3 examples across the continent: Senegal, Ghana, and Rwanda, that are about to implement universal health care across the continent. So that needs to continue to progress, and it will take time, like every emerging country around the world. You know, it takes time to change things and make things progress. And at the same time, you know, we want as APO Group to continue to be one of the positive corporate narrative across the continent, showing what is done by corporations. You know, when we send the press release, a lot of people are saying it. A lot of people are seeing that PepsiCo is investing, that Orange is investing, that Facebook is investing. And that would give ideas to other people. So I personally believe that the corporate sector, the private sector, have the major role to play as a driver of investment. And the combination of the government, you know, working with the private sector can only be a success if it's structured, if it's planned, and like you say, if it's implemented.
And also, another aspect of your business is that you're supporters of Rugby Africa.
We are indeed.
And there's a World Cup going on as we speak. And it's amazing the growth of African rugby unions in the last few years.
Well, you know, when I joined the company as a chief executive, I was very surprised about the statistic of the sport. You had about 10 years ago 9 federations across the continent, and 10 years later you have 38 federations across the continent structuring and playing rugby, which makes it the 2nd largest growing sport across the continent after football, which makes it the 1st growing sport, women's sport, which makes it, in my opinion, a fantastic platform for the young generation to get hope, to continue to dream. I'm a strong believer in sport, you know, for the younger generation. We selected rugby because, you know, we believe that this is a fantastic platform for the young generation, apart from the fact that Nicolas Pompin-Mognan, the chairman of the company, is a rugby fanatic. We've seen also, since we sponsor the sport and obviously promote the sport, you know, the difference that some of the international federations are looking at this sport in Africa. Because as APO, we have the means to promote the news not only on the continent, but also abroad. I may also mention at that stage the partnership we have with Getty Images. We signed a partnership this year, and you know Getty Image, you know, the world leader in image management. And the first contact we had with them 3 years ago was through rugby. They helped us to promote African rugby and putting all the images on their platform. And as you know, they are, you know, putting images from all the sport around the world, but they were particularly interested about rugby in Africa. Because of the relationship we had with them, 2 years later, we signed a strategic partnership with them to develop their footprint across Africa, because they strongly believe that they can also make difference.
What are the emerging rugby nations of Africa that maybe we haven't heard of this time, but the next World Cup we might?
Well, I mean, you know, we all know the quality of the South African team, that is not to be proven anymore. But you have nations like Kenya that are doing very, very well on rugby 15, but also particularly on rugby 7. Kenya is one of the best nations in the world. We are particularly, as APO Group, following the development of Namibia, which is the 2nd team participating at the moment, 2nd African team participating to the World Cup. And one of the particularity of this team is that they're all amateurs and they're all passionate.
Namibia, yeah, it's an amateur team, isn't it? So
It is an amateur team.
it's the last one, I understand, or one of the last ones in the World Cup that is amateur.
It is, to my knowledge, the last one of the last one, if not the last one, which makes their performance absolutely unbelievable. And following this team, we also hear a story about players those players have to work. It's not like they do rugby every single day. You know, they wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning, they went training at 6 o'clock, they go to work, and then they go training again in the evening. And for me, it makes it really a fantastic example.
We look at it when South Africa won in 1995, they were virtually amateur. But do you think that there's going to be, in the future, you think Africa might be able to dominate the world rugby scene with these emerging nations coming up?
The more, you know, the federation is structured, the more funding they have to be able to make the player travel, the more infrastructure they have, the more visibility they have, you know, the more the rugby will develop. And we've seen the growth of the rugby, particularly the rugby 7, in a very, very fast speed. The Kenya team of rugby grew over the last 5 to 6 years. So yes, I believe Rugby Africa will show in the next 5 to 10 years what it's capable to do, and will be surely probably producing 1 or 2 other national teams that will compete with the best teams in the world.
I'm afraid that's all we've got time for on this edition of Captains of Industry. From me, Chris Bishop, in Dubai, it's goodbye.